On May 18, 1969, 3 American astronauts were hurtling through space aboard Apollo 10, conducting what NASA called the final dress rehearsal before humanity would attempt to land on the Moon. Commander Thomas Stafford, Command Module Pilot John Young, and Lunar Module Pilot Eugene Cernan had been selected for this critical mission that would test every system, every procedure, every contingency except the actual landing itself. They would descend to within 9 miles of the lunar surface, closer than any humans had ever been, and then return home. It was supposed to be routine, at least by the standards of spaceflight in 1969. But something happened during that mission that wouldn't be revealed to the public for nearly half a century. Something that, when it finally came to light, would spark debates about government transparency, the nature of space exploration, and what exactly occurred during that hour when 3 men orbited the far side of the Moon, completely cut off from all human contact. The Apollo 10 mission launched from Kennedy Space Center at 12:49 p.m. Eastern Time. The Saturn V rocket performed flawlessly, and within days, the crew had entered lunar orbit. Their primary objective was straightforward: to prove that the lunar module could undock from the command module, descend toward the Moon's surface, and then successfully rendezvous and redock. Everything that Apollo 11 would need to do, except touchdown. The stakes were enormous. If Apollo 10 succeeded, NASA would greenlight Apollo 11 for a landing attempt. If it failed, the entire timeline would slip, possibly allowing the Soviet Union to beat America to the lunar surface. President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the Moon before the end of the decade hung in the balance, with only months remaining. The mission was designated as Apollo 10 specifically because it was the 10th in the Apollo program, though only the 4th to carry a crew into space and the 2nd to orbit the Moon. Apollo 8 had made the first circumlunar voyage just months earlier in December 1968, proving that humans could survive the journey and return safely. Apollo 9 had tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Now, Apollo 10 would combine those achievements, taking the lunar module to the Moon itself and putting it through its paces in the actual environment where it would need to perform. On May 22nd, Stafford and Cernan entered the lunar module, which they had nicknamed Snoopy, while John Young remained in the command module named Charlie Brown. The choice of names reflected the era's cultural touchstones. Peanuts was at the height of its popularity, and NASA had embraced the connection as good public relations. The 2 craft separated, and Snoopy began its descent toward the lunar surface. This meant that for a significant portion of their orbit, particularly when passing over the far side of the Moon, both spacecraft would be in complete radio silence with Earth. The Moon itself would block all communication. No voices from mission control. No telemetry being received. No way to call for help if something went catastrophically wrong. They were, in the most literal sense, alone. The far side of the Moon, often incorrectly called the dark side, is one of the most isolated locations in the solar system from a human perspective. It's not actually dark, it receives just as much sunlight as the near side, but it's forever hidden from Earth due to tidal locking. The Moon rotates at exactly the rate it orbits Earth, meaning the same face always points toward us. Ancient humans never saw the far side. Early astronomers could only speculate about it. Not until the Soviet Luna 3 probe in 1959 did humanity get its first grainy photographs of what lay beyond. What those images revealed was a landscape dramatically different from the familiar near side. Fewer Maria, those dark basaltic plains we see as the Man in the Moon. More craters. more ancient, heavily bombarded terrain. It's a testament to the moon's violent early history, preserved because the far side has fewer of the lava flows that resurfaced and smoothed much of the near side billions of years ago. For the Apollo 10 astronauts, passing over this alien landscape while cut off from all human contact was a profound psychological experience. During one of these passes over the far side, approximately 1 hour of total communications blackout, something strange occurred. The crew heard sounds coming through their headsets, not the usual static, not the familiar crackle of radio interference they had trained to recognize. This was different. A series of musical tones, whistling sounds that seemed almost melodic, lasting for extended periods. All 3 astronauts heard it clearly. The audio was distinct enough that they stopped what they were doing and discussed it amongst themselves, their conversation captured by onboard recording systems. The transcript of that conversation reveals genuine confusion. Cernan described it as outer space-type music. Stafford compared it to the sound you might hear if you were speeding by a bunch of telephone wires or electronic equipment. Young seemed equally perplexed. What's particularly striking about the transcript is what came next. The astronauts debated whether they should even report this to Mission Control. They worried about credibility. They worried about being taken seriously. In one exchange, one of them asks if they should tell Mission Control about it, and another responds that they probably should, but you can sense the hesitation in their words. These were test pilots, military men, individuals selected specifically because they could remain calm and analytical under pressure. Thomas Stafford had flown Gemini missions. John Young was already a veteran of 2 space flights. Eugene Cernan had walked in space during Gemini 9. These were not men easily rattled. Yet here they were, uncertain about reporting what they'd experienced. The conversation continued for several minutes as the sounds persisted. They tried to identify the source, running through possible explanations. Could it be an equipment issue? Some kind of interference? But from what? There was nothing out there to interfere with except the 2 spacecraft themselves. The Moon has no atmosphere, no ionosphere, none of the layers of charged particles that can affect radio propagation on Earth. Space around the Moon is about as empty as space gets in the inner solar system. Eventually, the spacecraft emerged from behind the Moon. Communication with Earth was re-established, and the mission continued. The astronauts did report the sounds to Mission Control, though the details of that conversation and Mission Control's immediate response are less clear from publicly available transcripts. What is known is that the mission proceeded without any significant alarm being raised. The mission continued for several more days. Snoopy and Charlie Brown successfully redocked. The crew performed additional tests and observations, and on May 26th, they splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The mission was declared a complete success. NASA announced that Apollo 11 would attempt a landing. What happened next is where things become peculiar. The audio recordings from Apollo 10 were archived by NASA, along with thousands of hours of other mission recordings. The tapes sat in storage, technically available to researchers but practically forgotten among the vast documentation of the Apollo program. No press releases mentioned strange sounds. No post-mission debriefings made public reference to the incident. The astronauts themselves rarely, if ever, discussed it in interviews during the decades that followed. For all intents and purposes, the event was buried, not necessarily through any sinister cover-up, but through simple bureaucratic inertia and the sheer volume of Apollo documentation. To understand how something like this could be overlooked for so long, you have to appreciate the scale of the Apollo documentation. Each mission generated millions of pages of documentation, hundreds of hours of audio, thousands of photographs. There were flight plans, mission reports, technical debriefings, medical examinations, geological analyses, engineering reviews, and countless other categories of records. NASA employed thousands of people during the Apollo era, and each of them was generating documentation. The result is an archive so massive that fully cataloging and digitizing it is a task that continues to this day. In that context, a few minutes of unusual audio that didn't affect the mission outcome could easily get lost. Years turned into decades. The Apollo program ended with Apollo 17 in December 1972. The Space Shuttle era began with the first launch in 1981. A new generation of astronauts flew who had been children or not yet born during Apollo. The moon receded in the public imagination, replaced by space stations, planetary probes, and eventually, the International Space Station and Mars rovers. Apollo became history, its astronauts aging, its hardware residing in museums. And still, those tapes sat in archives, the strange sounds from the far side of the moon unheard by the public. Then, slowly, whispers began to emerge. By the early 2000s, the Internet had matured into a powerful tool for information sharing and conspiracy theorizing. Occasional references to unusual sounds during Apollo missions appeared on forums dedicated to space exploration and alternative history. These were vague, often third-hand accounts, easily dismissed as exaggeration or fabrication. Someone claimed to have read a document. Someone else heard from a friend who worked at NASA, the usual texture of Internet rumors. But something had leaked, enough that researchers began asking questions. In 2008, some details about the Apollo 10 sounds surfaced more concretely, though still without the actual audio being made public. Space historians who had access to NASA archives began mentioning the incident in books and articles. The narrative began to take shape. 3 astronauts had heard something strange on the far side of the moon. They had debated reporting it, and NASA had kept it quiet. The story gained traction among conspiracy theorists who saw it as evidence of everything from alien surveillance to secret government knowledge about extraterrestrial activity. The timing seemed suspicious to them. Why would this emerge now, decades later? What else was NASA hiding? The conspiracy community has long been fascinated by Apollo, spinning theories about faked landings, covered-up discoveries, and aliens watching humanity's first steps on another world. The Apollo 10 sounds fit perfectly into those narratives, but without the recordings themselves, it remained speculation and rumor. That changed in February 2016. NASA officially released the audio recordings as part of a media event tied to a cable television show exploring unexplained files from the space agency's history. The program was called NASA's Unexplained Files, a Science Channel production that leaned heavily into mystery and speculation. Suddenly, after 47 years, the world could hear exactly what Stafford, Young, and Cernan had heard on the far side of the moon. The audio was uploaded to the Internet, and within hours it had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story. Social media exploded with shares and commentary. YouTube videos analyzing the sounds proliferated. For a brief moment, Apollo 10 was back in the public consciousness in a way it hadn't been since 1969. The sounds themselves are genuinely eerie when you listen to them without context. A sustained whistling tone that rises and falls, almost like wind through a narrow gap, but with an electronic quality. It persists for minutes at a time, not brief static bursts, but long continuous notes that waver and modulate. Listening to it, you can understand why the astronauts were unnerved. It doesn't sound like typical radio static. It doesn't sound mechanical in the usual sense. It sounds, for lack of a better word, otherworldly. There's an almost musical quality to it, as Cernan noted, not in the sense of melody or harmony, but in the sense of sustained tones with pitch and timbre. The human ear naturally tries to find patterns in sounds, and these whistles seem to have pattern-like qualities even if no actual pattern exists. The Internet responded predictably. Alien theories dominated discussion threads. Was this some kind of transmission? A beacon? Evidence that the moon was under observation by extraterrestrial intelligence? Comparisons were drawn to other unexplained space phenomena. Claims of UFO encounters by astronauts, though most of those claims are either misattributed or lack credible evidence. Every conspiracy theory that had ever swirled around the space program found new life in this audio. Audio engineers downloaded the files and analyzed them with modern software, creating spectrograms that visualized the frequency content of the sounds. Some claimed to find mathematical relationships in the frequencies. Others insisted it was clearly artificial in origin, too regular to be random interference. Online communities dedicated to the paranormal and unexplained embraced the story enthusiastically. NASA's official explanation was released alongside the audio, though it received far less attention than the sounds themselves. According to the space agency, the sounds were caused by radio interference between the VHF radios in the lunar module and the command module. When the two spacecraft were in close proximity, but on slightly different frequencies, their radios could create interference patterns that manifested as these whistling tones. NASA engineers stated this was a known phenomenon, something that had been understood since the Apollo missions themselves, even if this particular instance was more pronounced than usual. The technical explanation went like this. Both spacecraft used VHF radios for communication between each other when they were separated in lunar orbit. VHF, or Very High Frequency Radio, operates in the range of 30 to 300 MHz. The Apollo spacecraft specifically used frequencies around 259 MHz for their VHF communications. When two VHF transmitters are near each other and operating on frequencies that are close but not identical, they can create what's called heterodyne interference. The two signals effectively blend together in the receiver, and the difference between their frequencies creates a new tone that can be heard as a whistle or hum. The closer the frequencies, the lower the pitch of the resulting sound. If one radio is transmitting at 259.7 MHz and another at 259.71 MHz, the difference of 0.01 MHz or 10 kHz would produce an audible tone. This is established radio physics, documented in electronics textbooks and experienced by ham radio operators regularly. Amateur radio enthusiasts often encounter heterodyne interference when multiple stations operate on nearby frequencies. The phenomenon is also exploited deliberately in superheterodyne receivers, a common radio design that uses frequency mixing to improve signal processing. So the underlying physics is well understood and uncontroversial. But this explanation, while technically sound, raised immediate questions among those following the story. If this was a known phenomenon, why did the astronauts seem so puzzled by it? These were men who had undergone exhaustive training over months and years. They had been briefed on every possible technical issue they might encounter, from catastrophic failures to minor annoyances. NASA's training regimen for Apollo crews was legendarily thorough, covering everything from geology to navigation to emergency procedures. Why would they be confused and even hesitant to report something that was supposedly routine? The counter-argument from NASA and space historians was that while VHF interference was known in principle, the specific manifestation during Apollo 10 was unusually pronounced and sustained. The astronauts had likely been briefed on typical radio issues, things like static from solar activity or brief interference from equipment. But this particular instance was more dramatic than what they'd experienced in training simulations. The unique acoustic environment of the spacecraft, where sounds reverberate differently than on Earth, might have made the whistles seem more prominent or unusual. The specific positioning of the two vehicles relative to each other, the geometry of their radio antennas, and perhaps other factors combined to create something that sounded different enough to be noteworthy. Additionally, the psychological context cannot be ignored. Hearing these sounds while completely isolated on the far side of the Moon, unable to contact Earth, unable to consult with experts on the ground, would naturally make any anomaly seem more significant. If the same sounds had occurred while in communication with Mission Control, the astronauts could have immediately asked about them and received reassurance. Instead, they had to puzzle it out themselves and decide whether it warranted concern. Then there's the question of classification and public release. If this was simply radio interference, a mundane technical issue with a straightforward explanation, why wasn't it discussed openly at the time? Why did it take 47 years for the audio to be released to the public? This is perhaps the most difficult question to answer satisfactorily, and it's where even skeptics of conspiracy theories find themselves wondering about NASA's motivations. NASA's position is that the recordings were never technically classified in the sense of being designated as secret for national security reasons. They were simply archived along with massive amounts of other mission data. The agency processes and releases historical materials on an ongoing basis as resources and public interest allow, and the Apollo 10 audio happened to be released in 2016 as part of that process. There was no deliberate suppression, just the practical reality that NASA has millions of documents, photos, audio files, and other materials from decades of missions, and making them publicly accessible is a slow, resource-intensive process that depends on funding, personnel, and priorities. But skeptics found this unconvincing. They pointed out that NASA had been making Apollo materials available online for years before 2016, particularly as the 40th anniversary of the moon landing in 2009 prompted a renewed effort to digitize and share historical materials. Major missions had their key moments documented and released. Iconic communications like Apollo 13's problem report were widely available. Why did these particular recordings take so long? Why did they only surface in connection with a television program that was explicitly about unexplained mysteries? The timing seemed suspiciously convenient, almost as if NASA was using entertainment media to control the narrative around potentially embarrassing or confusing historical incidents. By releasing the audio through a show that framed it as mysterious, NASA could allow the information to become public, while simultaneously providing their explanation and managing expectations. It's a cynical interpretation, but not an entirely unreasonable one given how institutions handle potentially controversial information. To understand whether the NASA explanation holds water, it helps to examine the technical details more closely. VHF radio interference is absolutely real and well documented, not just in space but in countless terrestrial applications. During the Apollo missions, the Command Module and Lunar Module used VHF to communicate with each other when they were separated. These were relatively simple radios by today's standards, using technology that was state-of-the-art in the 1960s, but would be considered primitive now. They used amplitude modulation for voice communication, which is more susceptible to interference than modern digital communication methods. If the two spacecraft were transmitting simultaneously, or if there were slight frequency differences due to equipment variants, temperature effects on the oscillators that generate radio frequencies, or Doppler effects from their relative motion, interference could occur. The whistling sound would be the audio manifestation of the beat frequency between the two signals, heard through the astronauts' headsets as the radio receivers tried to process multiple inputs simultaneously. What makes this explanation plausible is that the sounds occurred specifically during the period when Snoopy and Charlie Brown were separated and in lunar orbit. This is exactly when VHF interference would be most likely to occur. The two spacecraft were in relatively close proximity, close enough for their radios to pick up each other's signals strongly, but moving relative to each other, which could cause frequency shifts. Once the spacecraft redocked, the sounds would have ceased because the radios would have been powered down or reconfigured. The timing matches perfectly with what we'd expect from VHF interference. Additionally, similar interference patterns have been documented in other radio communication scenarios, both in space and on Earth. Ham radio operators report hearing whistles and warbles when multiple stations transmit on nearby frequencies. Aircraft communications sometimes experience similar effects. The physics is consistent and reproducible. However, what's unusual about the Apollo 10 sounds is the duration and consistency. Listening to the recordings, the tones persist for extended periods, sometimes minutes at a time, with relatively stable frequency characteristics. The pitch rises and falls slowly rather than cutting in and out abruptly. Typical VHF interference tends to be more sporadic, more variable, especially when caused by moving platforms where Doppler effects would constantly change the frequency relationships. This has led some researchers to suggest that while interference might be the basic explanation, there could have been additional factors at play. Perhaps the spacecraft's metallic structures were acting as resonators, amplifying certain frequencies. Perhaps the vacuum of space and the lack of atmospheric absorption allowed the radio waves to interact in ways that would be less pronounced in Earth's atmosphere. Perhaps there were multipath effects where radio waves reflected off the lunar surface or off the spacecraft themselves, creating complex interference patterns. These are speculations attempting to bridge the gap between the standard explanation and the unusual characteristics of what was recorded. Another angle to consider is whether similar phenomena occurred on other Apollo missions. If VHF interference was the cause, and if the conditions for such interference existed on multiple missions, we should expect to find other instances of astronauts reporting strange sounds. The historical record on this is mixed and incomplete. There are scattered references in Apollo mission transcripts to various unusual noises, though none quite as dramatic or well documented as the Apollo 10 incident. Apollo 11, which launched just 2 months after Apollo 10, does not have widely publicized reports of similar sounds, though researchers have noted that Armstrong and Aldrin spent less time in separated flight profiles, and their mission parameters were slightly different. The lunar module descent and landing meant that the two spacecraft were separated for a shorter duration and in a different geometric configuration than during Apollo 10's extended orbital operations. Later Apollo missions, particularly those involving longer lunar stays and more complex orbital mechanics, might have experienced similar interference, but if they did, it wasn't prominently reported or discussed. This could mean several things. It might mean that after Apollo 10, NASA briefed subsequent crews more thoroughly on the possibility of VHF interference, so they weren't surprised by it and didn't feel the need to discuss it extensively. The Apollo 10 crew's reaction and their debate about reporting it might have prompted mission planners to add this specific briefing to pre-flight training. It might mean that the specific conditions that created the pronounced sounds during Apollo 10 weren't perfectly replicated on later missions. Small differences in orbital parameters, the orientation of antennas, the exact frequencies used, or the power settings of the radios could all affect whether interference occurs and how prominent it sounds. Or it might mean that other crews did hear similar things, but, having been forewarned, simply didn't consider it worth mentioning in detail. Without access to all the audio recordings from all Apollo missions, which runs into hundreds of hours of material, much of it still not digitized or publicly available, it's difficult to say definitively. NASA has been gradually releasing more Apollo audio over the years, and researchers continue to comb through it looking for interesting moments and anomalies. If similar incidents occurred on other missions, they may yet be discovered in archives. There's also the human psychological element to consider in greater depth. The far side of the moon is a genuinely eerie place from a human perspective. It's the only location humans have ever been where they were completely cut off from Earth, not just by distance but by a physical barrier. No radio waves can penetrate the moon's mass. For that hour of each orbit, the Apollo astronauts were more isolated than any humans had ever been. They couldn't call home. They couldn't receive guidance. If something went wrong, they were on their own until they emerged back into line of sight with Earth. The psychological weight of this isolation is difficult to overstate. In that context, hearing unexpected sounds, even if ultimately explainable, would naturally be unsettling. The human brain is wired to find patterns and assign meaning, especially in unfamiliar or threatening environments. Evolution has given us a hair-trigger response to unexpected stimuli because our ancestors who investigated every strange sound were more likely to survive than those who ignored potential threats. The astronauts were well-trained professionals, but they were still human beings with the same basic neurological architecture as everyone else. It's entirely possible that the combination of genuine VHF interference and the psychological weight of their isolation made the experience more impactful than the same sounds might have been in a different context. This doesn't diminish what they experienced. It simply adds another layer to understanding their reactions and why the incident has resonated so strongly with people decades later. The sounds themselves became a symbol of the isolation and strangeness of space exploration, of the fact that even with all our technology and planning, astronauts still encounter the unexpected. The declassification timeline remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire story. Even accepting NASA's explanation that the materials were simply archived and gradually released, the specific trigger for the 2016 release deserves scrutiny. The audio became public in conjunction with a Science Channel show called NASA's Unexplained Files. This was not a documentary series with a reputation for rigorous scientific skepticism. It was entertainment television that leaned into mystery and speculation, packaging space history as a series of enigmas to be pondered rather than problems to be solved. The decision to release the Apollo 10 audio through this venue, rather than through NASA's own historical archives or through academic channels, struck many observers as strange. One possible explanation is pragmatic. Television production companies often approach NASA requesting access to unusual or dramatic historical materials. The space agency's Media Relations Office would naturally comply with such requests, seeing them as opportunities for public engagement and for keeping space history in the public consciousness. From NASA's perspective, having their materials featured on a cable television show, even one with a sensationalistic bent, is better than having those materials sit in archives unknown to the public. It's free publicity, and it fulfills part of NASA's mandate to share its discoveries and experiences with the American people who fund the agency. But there's also a more calculated interpretation. By releasing potentially controversial or confusing materials through entertainment media, NASA can ensure that the information becomes public while maintaining some control over how it's framed. If the Apollo 10 audio had been released through a straightforward archive dump with minimal context, it might have sparked even wilder speculation. By partnering with a television show, NASA could ensure that their official explanation was presented alongside the audio itself, right from the beginning. Viewers would hear the sounds and immediately hear NASA's interpretation of those sounds. This is classic public relations strategy, controlling the narrative by being the first to tell the story. Whether this was deliberate or simply how things worked out is impossible to know without access to internal NASA communications from that period, which are unlikely to be made public anytime soon. When the audio was released, several of the astronauts were still living. Thomas Stafford and Eugene Cernan were in their 80s by 2016, and John Young would pass away in 2018 at age 87. Media outlets naturally reached out for comments, looking for their contemporary perspective on what they'd heard nearly 5 decades earlier. The responses were measured and consistent with NASA's technical explanation. Stafford, in interviews, essentially confirmed that it was interference, and that while unusual, it wasn't a major concern at the time. He downplayed the mystery, suggesting that the confusion evident in the transcript was more about the novelty of the sound than genuine alarm. This is consistent with how test pilots typically frame unexpected experiences, as problems to be analyzed and understood rather than sources of fear or wonder. But some who listened carefully to those later interviews noted a certain weariness in how the astronauts discussed it, as if they'd been asked about it too many times and had long since settled on the least sensational explanation. Whether this reflected their genuine beliefs or a desire to avoid fueling conspiracy theories is impossible to determine. After spending decades in the public eye, after fielding countless questions about moon landings and space exploration, these men had learned what answers satisfied people and what answers led to more questions. They may have genuinely believed the interference explanation, or they may have simply decided it was the most reasonable thing to tell the public. We can't know their private thoughts. The alternative theories, and there are many, tend to fall into predictable categories. The most popular is some form of extraterrestrial explanation. Proponents argue that the sounds could have been a transmission or signal from an alien presence monitoring human activity on or around the moon. They point to the fact that the sounds occurred on the far side, the hidden face of the moon that would be an ideal location for covert observation. If aliens wanted to watch humanity's first tentative steps into space without being detected from Earth, the far side of the moon would be the perfect vantage point. The logic continues that the sounds might have been a scanning beam, a communication between alien devices, or even an attempt to communicate with the astronauts themselves. The problems with this theory are numerous and fundamental. First, there's no physical evidence beyond the audio itself, and the audio is entirely consistent with radio interference. Second, if this were a deliberate transmission, it's unclear what purpose it would serve. Why musical tones? why not attempt communication in a way that would be unambiguous? If aliens possessed the technology to monitor human spacecraft, presumably they would also possess the ability to understand human communication methods and could have sent a message we would recognize as such. Third, if aliens were present and observing, why would they reveal themselves through audio transmission but leave no other trace? No visual sightings, no effects on spacecraft systems, no detectable signals from other instruments. The extraterrestrial explanation requires adding enormous speculative assumptions to account for something that already has a prosaic explanation. It's not impossible, but it violates the principle of parsimony that guides scientific reasoning. We should prefer the simplest explanation that accounts for the observed facts. Another theory involves natural phenomena related to the Moon's environment, or the space surrounding it. Could solar wind interacting with the lunar surface create some kind of electromagnetic effect that the spacecraft's systems picked up as audio? Could cosmic rays or other high-energy particles have interfered with the electronics in an unusual way? The Moon does have a very tenuous exosphere, essentially isolated atoms and molecules that have been knocked off the surface by solar wind and micrometeorite impacts. But it's far too thin to carry sound waves in any conventional sense. These theories at least have the advantage of being grounded in known physics, but they face significant problems. NASA's spacecraft were bristling with instruments designed to measure electromagnetic phenomena, radiation levels, and environmental conditions. If there had been unusual electromagnetic activity strong enough to affect the radios, other instruments would have detected it. The scientific data from Apollo 10 shows nothing anomalous during the period when the sounds occurred. The environmental conditions were exactly what was expected. There were no solar flares, no unusual cosmic ray events, nothing that would explain electromagnetic interference beyond what the VHF radios themselves could produce. A third category of alternative explanation focuses on the spacecraft itself, suggesting some kind of malfunction or unexpected interaction between systems. Could there have been a short circuit, a loose connection, or some other technical glitch that produced the sounds? Complex electronic systems can behave in unexpected ways, especially in the extreme environment of space with its temperature fluctuations, radiation exposure, and vacuum conditions. Equipment that works perfectly on Earth can fail or behave strangely in space. This is why NASA tests everything so exhaustively. However, NASA engineers exhaustively reviewed the spacecraft systems after every mission, and no malfunctions were noted in Apollo 10's radio equipment. Moreover, both spacecraft were hearing the sounds simultaneously, which would suggest either a shared malfunction, which is highly improbable given they were separate vehicles with separate systems, or transmission of sounds from one to the other, which brings us back to radio interference. If a malfunction in one spacecraft's radio was generating the tones, the other spacecraft would only hear them if they were being transmitted, which is functionally the same as the interference explanation. The idea of some unknown interaction between spacecraft systems is intriguing, but lacks evidence. What could two spacecraft in lunar orbit interact with that would produce sustained audio tones? There's nothing there except the spacecraft themselves and the radio waves they're emitting. Unless we want to propose entirely new physics, unknown forms of energy or interaction that somehow escaped detection by all the other instruments, we're left with the radio interference explanation. Ultimately, the scientific consensus remains that VHF radio interference is the most likely explanation for the Apollo 10 sounds. It's consistent with the timing, the technical configuration of the spacecraft, established principles of radio physics, and requires no additional assumptions about unknown phenomena or extraordinary events. The explanation accounts for when the sounds started, why they had the characteristics they did, why they stopped when the spacecraft redocked, and why similar phenomena have been observed in other contexts. It fits all the available data. But consensus explanations, no matter how well supported, rarely satisfy those who are drawn to mysteries. The appeal of the Apollo 10 story isn't really about the sounds themselves. It's about what they represent. The far side of the moon remains one of the most isolated places humans have ever reached. The idea that something unexpected happened there, something that couldn't immediately be explained, something that was then hidden from the public for decades, taps into deep-seated feelings about exploration, the unknown, and the limits of human knowledge. We want space to be mysterious. We want there to be discoveries waiting out there that will change everything. A technical glitch with radios doesn't satisfy that desire. Alien signals or unknown natural phenomena do. The 47-year delay in releasing the audio, regardless of the bureaucratic reasons behind it, adds a layer of intrigue that makes the story compelling even if the underlying explanation is mundane. It feeds into suspicions that governments and large organizations can't be trusted to be transparent, that they hide things from the public, that there are always secrets waiting to be uncovered. In that sense, the real mystery isn't what the astronauts heard. It's why the incident resonates so strongly with people decades later, and what that says about how we think about space exploration, government transparency, and our place in the universe. As of now, more than 50 years after Apollo 10, the incident remains a footnote in space history. The audio is freely available online. NASA's explanation has been stated and restated. The astronauts who experienced it have shared their perspectives. For those satisfied with the interference explanation, the case is closed. It's an interesting technical incident, a reminder that even well-planned missions encounter the unexpected, but nothing more. For those who see larger patterns or possibilities, it remains an intriguing data point. Perhaps not proof of anything extraordinary, but a reminder that space is still strange and unfamiliar, that our understanding is incomplete, and that there may be phenomena we haven't yet recognized or explained. The sounds from the far side of the moon have become part of space lore, retold and reinterpreted by each generation. They've been featured in documentaries, discussed in books, analyzed in YouTube videos, and debated in online forums. They've inspired speculation, creativity, and wonder. In a way, that's more valuable than any single explanation could be. The Apollo 10 sounds remind us why we explore, why we venture into the unknown despite the risks and uncertainties. They remind us that space is not just a vacuum to be crossed or a resource to be exploited, but a frontier that still holds surprises. Whether those surprises are profound discoveries or simple technical glitches almost doesn't matter. What matters is that we keep looking, keep listening, and keep asking questions about what we find out there in the vast darkness beyond our world.